Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 2 game from the Charlotte Spring GM-IM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I won my first game against International Master Brandon Jacobson in pretty good fashion. It was a great way to start the tournament, and I was kind of looking to keep the same continuity going here in round 2. My opponent was Grandmaster David Berczes, a player from Hungary who's been living in the United States for a few years pursuing a master's degree. He's another one of these foreign grandmasters that's been getting an education in the United States, and so he's been active in the U.S. scene for quite a while now. I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that I know him pretty decently, and he's a good guy. It's always fun when he's around, and he's not your typical chess player. He's a pretty awesome personality. So yeah, always nice to be around him. But there are no friends on the chessboard, and so we are both going for each other's throats in this one. In any case, he was white, and I knew it was going to be a tough game. He's a very positional player, and and also very well prepared, so I knew I had to be ready. He opened with knight f3. I played d5, and he went c4, and c4 is pretty much inviting me to go d4 in many instances, and you play like a reversed Benoni type of structure, but I didn't really want to go for those, so I decided to play e6. And then he went for g3, and g3 introduces these Catalan type of structures. It's kind of like a Queen's Gambit decline Catalan situation. I went knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7. Note, I'm not really keen on taking the pawn because he can kind of recover it right away with queen a4 check if he wants to, or he can gambit it and argue that the bishop on the long diagonal offers him good play, good compensation. I didn't want to test his knowledge there, so I just kept developing. So I played d4 now. I castled, and now he played queen c2. Queen c2 is a little bit of a sideline of the Catalan. The most popular move is to castle now and then invite the capture on c4. There are a lot of forcing lines for black in this particular variation, like after taking. There's knight e5 as an option, queen c2 is an option now. Even just gambiting that pawn with knight c3 is an option, a4 is an option. And I think what David wanted to do by playing queen c2 was essentially cut down on the different lines that black has, because now if I take the pawn, he can go queen takes c4, and it's just a little bit different, a slightly different version of the line. Now, the other thing to point out is that in this position, the most common move, or I think the most principled move, is actually to play c5. I've seen this before. And the idea is that since white hasn't castled, you try to attack the center right away and break and rip it open. But I wasn't really keen on finding out what ideas he had here, and I went for the more modest c6. Black castled, and now I went for knight bd7. And the idea with this setup with c6 is just to kind of establish a wall of pawns and make it difficult for white's light-squared bishop to break out. So I was just trying to stay solid. White played rook d1 here, and this was a move that kind of threw me for a whirl a little bit because it was not what I'd expected, and it kind of introduces some unpleasant ideas. In many instances, if I try to go for b6, he actually can try to go knight e5. So one of the things I was worried about is, like, if b6, let's say knight e5, bishop b7, and then like takes, and knight c6. And the point is that after, I'm going to give up the bishop pair in some way, shape, or form. I can give it up like this and play this type of position, or I can play queen e8 after knight c6, and then he takes this one. And in both cases, white has a very nice risk-free position because he has the bishop pair in a fairly symmetrical structure. And you might argue that this bishop on g2 is not very good right now, but a lot of times what winds up happening is it can pop out to f1 and exert itself on this diagonal. And I don't know, I wasn't in the mood to kind of defend this type of position, so I wasn't keen on this type of line. And separately, after knight e5, you might say, well, why can't you just take on e5? Well, you can, but I was really concerned about lines like this where white can break with e4. there's certain lines like this that really concern me because, you know, if I take on e4 like this rook is pinning the knight, and after bishop takes e4, this rook is hit. There's also h7 is hit. So I think white has an advantage here. And you can play d4, I believe, but I don't believe you have enough compensation giving up the pawn here. So I just wasn't really confident in these lines. And because once I saw this rook d1 and knight e5 idea, I was kind of like, my idea of just playing b6 and bishop b7 was not really something that I could get away with or that I wanted to get away with. So I actually went knight e4. And knight e4 is not necessarily a huge mistake, but it's definitely inconsistent with the way I was trying to play this position, and in that sense, it's probably not ideal. The point is that now with knight e4, I might be trying to play f5 and justifying my knight on this square. The issue is that it can be undermined pretty easily with knight d2, and you know, when you play f5, you weaken the king side square, you weaken some squares around your king, particularly the dark squares, and so it's a very committal decision. But you can see how just this move, rook d1, kind of threw me off a little bit, and I thought I had to do something I wouldn't normally do. White actually did play knight bd2, which is a good move. Again, sort of challenging my knight right away so it can't stay there. And I really want to justify the knight here because it didn't make sense to me if I took and then just bishop takes. It just seems like white has a very nice position now. You can see his rooks are already connected. My bishop is still a dead piece on c8. And I'm just very limited. And white can also prepare an e4 push at some point. So I decided to justify my knight's position on e4 by going f5. But this move is actually a clear mistake. And it's a clear mistake because of white's follow-up. So why don't you pause the video for a moment and try and figure out why this move is a mistake? What can white do to really, you know, throw me for a loop here? So I'll give you 5 seconds to pause the video and you can try and figure it out. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and think on what white did here. White played the very, very strong move, knight e1. And knight e1 is actually somewhat counterintuitive because you move the knight backwards. But the idea is that now this knight relocates to d3 where it eyes two of my potential pawn breaks, both c5 and e5. And additionally, you also introduce the idea of playing f3, dislodging the knight at a convenient moment. So the point is that this knight e1 really ensures that my knight on e4 is not completely secure. So that's one idea. And then the other thing is actually this knight on d2 doesn't really want to trade on e4 because I go f takes e4 and have a nice pawn center. So he can actually even play around the knight in some instances. And so the point is if you put this one on d3, now this one can come to f3 and you have two knights basically keying on the e5 square, and then you can play f3 later. So really, really nice move, and one that I kind of underestimated. I went knight df6, still trying to justify my knight's position here, but also to try and just consider trying to develop my bishop to d7 and getting it around the horn, so to speak, because I really need to connect my rooks as soon as possible. The other option is to develop the bishop via b6 with b6 and bishop b7, but I was reluctant to play b6 because that would weaken my control on the c file, particularly the c6 square, and I could envision a scenario where white winds up playing c takes d5, and then the c6 square being very sensitive. So that's why I decided to try and develop the other way. White went knight d3, again, now keying in on these weak dark squares that are basically a chronic issue when you're playing the Dutch Stonewall. And keep in mind, I didn't actually intend to play a Stonewall. It was kind of because this rook d1 move threw me for a loop a little bit. I thought, okay, desperate times. But you can see I really was not keen on playing this type of position. I went knight takes d2, and you might say that's actually another mistake because now this actually helps white kind of free his game and get his bishop out. I maybe should have just developed and played a move like b6. Point being that I just put the bishop on b7 anyway, despite the c6 weakness. And something along the lines of knight e5, bishop b7, knight takes e4 could have transpired. And I'm still kind of holding on here. The point is that if you go c takes d5, c takes d5, there is knight c6, but I could consider just playing bishop takes c6 and arguing that this bishop on g2 is not that much better than the knight on e4 right now, and so the bishop pair is not as big a deal right now. Although I should say rook c8 right away hangs my e6 pawn, so it needs to be prepared. So maybe actually queen d7 is more prudent, and then you play it this way. And you just argue this bishop on g2 is not so hot right now. Anyways, I did take on d2. It is what it is. And after bishop takes d2, you can see I'm woefully behind development, and I lack control in the center. So I have some problems here. I went knight e4, putting that other knight there, challenging the bishop on d2. And now white went bishop e1, which is a very classic maneuver in these Catalans, where you put the rook on d1, and then the bishop goes to d2 and e1. And from e1, it's actually really nice. The point is that it can always pop out to b4, a5 at the right moment. It also overprotects f2 in case that was a little bit loose because the rook left the square. And a lot of times you'll see the bishop on e1 and then another bishop come on f1 really eye the queen side. And it's just nice to have those bishops tucked back, not really being hit by anything, preserving them for the endgame. I went bishop d7, which is a desperate attempt to develop the bishop, but you can see here that the difference in pieces is pretty profound. White went queen b3, a good move. Now eyeing the b7 pawn, which is no longer protected because I moved my light square bishop. I went queen b6, trying to deal with that. Note that, again, a move like b6 I was not so keen on because I weakened the c6 square, and then the whole file comes under fire. Like if he goes like rook c1 here, you can see that now there's entry points, particularly the c6 pawn, after a subsequent exchange, and even knight e5, and just this square is very sensitive. So I didn't want to weaken that. That's why I went queen b6. And now white went e3, just defending the d4 pawn. And we actually have this tension that you see a lot of times in in d4 openings, which is the queen b3, queen b6 dilemma, I call it. The issue is that neither side really wants to capture the other. If white takes, then I take a takes b6, and I have a nice a file to operate with my rook, and the a pawn does a good job of actually covering the c5 square. So it's actually a pretty compact structure. Whereas on the flip side, I don't really want to play queen takes b3, because if I do it, then after a takes b3, he is the a file for his rook. And the other thing about the double pawns is they support the c pawn. So it's a way to also keep the tension on c4 effectively. So essentially, neither side really wants to take the other, and it's kind of a question of who can win the staring contest. And you see this a lot happen in d4 openings, particularly in the Slav. Now, I actually went queen takes b3 anyway because I did not believe I could keep the tension long enough. But you could argue I could have played bishop e8 and waited a little bit and maybe brought this bishop out to h5 where I could challenge the rook on d1. The thing that I was concerned about was that now a move like f3 would come, and the most natural square for my knight, d6, isn't a very good idea, because if I go knight d6, now c5 comes, skewering both my queen and knight, and after this trade, my knight does not have access to the c4 square. And a lot of times you'll see this thing happen where the white pawn can go b4, b5 in some type of battery style and undouble itself. Although here I do have knight b5, and maybe I could blockade, but I don't know. I just wasn't super confident with keeping the tension here, even though maybe I should have. Instead, I took, and after a takes b3, you could see that now white has a new front to work with on the a file, and this is very, very unpleasant because essentially I have a hole on e5, a hole on c5, the whole a file to work with. He can kick me away with f3, and he just has so many different plans to try and take advantage here. After a takes b3, I went rook fc8, essentially thinking about playing bishop e8, but again, I wanted to connect my rooks first, so I didn't want my rooks to be disconnected by going bishop e8 right away. And now white played f3, which was, again, the plan that we talked about before, where he kicks my knight away, and then this bishop maybe goes to f1. I went knight d6, backing up and eyeing the c4 pawn because I did kind of see that if you went c5, knight b5 would be a nice outpost for me. Another option was to go knight f6, though, and maybe that was a little bit more solid, just keeping an eye on the e4 break, and also not running into this nasty pin on b4 with bishop b4, which actually happened. Point is that now this knight is kind of frozen because this is unpleasant and my bishop is hanging. So white still has the advantage here, and you can see again these dark squares are problematic. I went bishop f8, just making sure my king was protecting the bishop and now giving my knight freedom to move if it needs to. And now white went for knight c5, another monster move. And you can see now that white is very much encroaching on my queenside pawns, the bishop on d7, and just kind of asking me very, very difficult questions because really he's actually just probing. He's trying to make me create another weakness, another target. He really would love to see me push the b pawn because then I'd have more weak light squares, and just very, very unpleasant. I went knight f7, which is tactically justified because if knight takes d7, now the bishop on b4 is hanging. So I actually would get that back. So let's say knight takes d7, bishop takes b4, and in this position, black is kind of holding because the knight on d7 now is doesn't have a great square to go to. My bishop is controlling a lot of good dark squares. And I can also kind of blockade these pawns from b4 by playing a move like a5. So this would actually be a good position for me. Instead, after knight f7, white went bishop c3. And this again kind of underlies the problems with my position because now the bishop on d7 is attacked, the pawn on b7 is attacked, and the pawn on e6 is also being eyed. So I can't just move the bishop away because my e6 pawn hangs, and then the whole position collapses. And I thought a move like rook d7 was probably unwise because it just seemed very awkward to put it here. I'm not sure if maybe knight takes d7 is just good enough, but he also can try and keep the tension and maybe start with a move like bishop f1. It's just very, very uncomfortable to play this. Because of that, I thought I kind of needed to, just get rid of the knight ASAP, and I actually played bishop takes c5. And now white is very happy because after d takes c5, he has the bishop pair and a whole beautiful diagonal to work with the bishop on c3. And you can see that even though these pawns are doubled, they really exert a lot of pressure on the center, and so it's not like this one is going to hang anytime soon. And I really just lack a lot of space in this position, and white is just massively better. I went bishop e8, trying to deal with the immediate threat of e4. Again, if I make a nothing move like, let's say I play like h6, well, e4 comes, and you can see that I can't even take on e4 because my d7 bishop is hanging. So white would actually just win a pawn. So I actually thought that bishop e8 actually just dealt with the e4 idea, and now I was hoping to maybe free my game in a few moves, playing like rook d8 or b6 or something along these lines just to free up my position. But little did I realize that white actually has e4 anyway, and this was a move that kind of shocked me to my system because it was here that I realized that I can't actually hold down the fortress in the middle, and I'm very, very uncoordinated, and he's trying to basically take advantage of that while I don't have my piece on good squares. So e4 was a power move, and hey, grandmasters are going to make some good moves. So I thought that was an impressive move to make. To add insult to injury, I was also in serious time trouble here. So, I was bad on the board and on the clock, and not a good combination. I went d takes e4, resolving that tension on the d5 pawn, and f takes e4 happens. And you see, even though I have 4 versus 3 on the king side, it doesn't really matter because the rook has this beautiful open file to deal with. This bishop has an awesome diagonal, and this bishop might wind up also having a diagonal as well. So it's just a tough spot. I went a6 trying to just defend the a7 pawn because I really wanted to go rook d8 and challenge the rook on the file. But I can't do that right away because my a7 pawn hangs. So that was something that was, bothersome to me. E takes f5 was played. E takes f5, and you might say, well, the dust is cleared and I'm kind of escaped a little bit. But the issue still remains that this bishop is unassailable, and now the rooks have two open files to work with. And he went to work with rook e1, an excellent move. Just shifting gears and trying to land on e7 now. And it's very, very difficult for me to stop that. Note that a move like bishop c7 doesn't really solve anything because now white can go rook a d1. And with these rooks on these files, this is just dominating. Note that I can't even contest with rook d7 because that would lose tactically to rook takes e8 and check. And after rook takes e8, my d7 rook is unprotected and white is just up a piece. So I can't even contest the rook on the e file. And this is a huge problem because if the rooks double, I don't really have much to say for myself. I went rook c7 anyway, and just to try and cover the 7th rank because I had to do it. But after rook a d1, I can't play rook d7, right? And I actually think this would have been a very fine move. I would have probably need to try and go knight g5 or h6 or something along those lines, but I don't believe in this position. Instead, my opponent actually played rook e3, and I thought this gave me some semblance of an opportunity to consolidate because at least now I have control of the 7th rank for a moment. But I still have to deal with this rook e1 threat and then doubling on rook e7, so that was something that was kind of concerning. The other thing that's actually something to think about is actually bishop a5 bishop a5 may come at some point, and this diagonal is actually very annoying because it means that my rook can't assume the d8 square, and again, this d7 rook will not be secure there, so I was also looking at bishop a5. That being said, I thought I need to be active somehow, and I went knight g5. And my idea with knight g5 was that maybe I can sack a pawn to try and get an opposite-colored bishop endgame by chucking in knight e4 at some point and just block the file. White went rook e1 anyway, doubling. And now I actually went bishop f7, just defending this bishop. My initial idea playing knight e4 I thought was incorrect because after bishop takes e4 and f takes e4 and rook takes, the more I looked at this position, the more I thought that even though there's opposite-colored bishops, it probably isn't holdable. Because let's say I play a move like bishop f7. Well, now after rook e7, these rooks get traded, and now my queenside pawns are so weak that I think I'm just losing. I mean, I can't defend this with rook b8. Well, actually, I can temporarily defend it because after rook b8, bishop e5, and rook e8, he can't take on b7 because the e5 bishop is hanging. But after rook b8, he can just make a move like, maybe even king f2. And the argument here is that my pieces are totally paralyzed. I mean, I'm in a situation where my rook is tied to this pawn. This bishop can't move because the g7 pawn is hanging. And this king could potentially walk in and wreak havoc because I don't really have any moves. So getting to the opposite-colored bishop endgame doesn't really solve anything because there's still rooks on the board, and the advantage still goes to the side that's attacking, and it's clearly white. So I thought that was problematic. So instead of knight e4, I went for bishop f7, just trying to hold the fort a little bit longer. White went rook e5 now, and I think that's a very, very good move, just challenging the f5 pawn and really just goading me into playing g6. But the issue is if I play g6, now this diagonal is again wide open for the bishop, and now there could be even checkmating ideas later. So I think g6 is I think rook e5 is an excellent choice. I was not keen on playing g6, so I thought now's my chance, if ever, to try and go for those opposite-colored bishop positions, even though I felt they were probably losing. And I went for knight e4. Unfortunately, though, the position is so dire that, after knight e4, he doesn't have to go for opposite-colored bishops. He can actually play bishop a5 and challenge my rook. And now the issue is my rook has to move, and now the f7 pawn is hanging or the f5 pawn is hanging anyway. So I went rook d7, but after rook takes f5, I'm a pawn down for nothing, and he still retains the 2 bishops and active rooks. So this position is totally lost, and I was just trying to make some moves and see what happens. So I tried to make something happen. I played knight d2. Attacking the b3 pawn. And at least for the moment, my rooks are active enough where there isn't some decisive breakthrough, but this is not a good position. White went rook e3. Note that if you go rook d1 trying to pin me, well, it's actually a good move. But I might be able to survive, maybe trying to play a move like rook d3 or something, but actually my initial idea, knight f3, just fails because after bishop f3, the rook is still protected. So even my trick knight d2 doesn't work. So I was sort of fortunate rook e3 was played. I went rook e8 here, trying to just trade the rooks just so I can still attack b3. White took, rook takes, bishop takes, and then went rook e5, challenging my bishop. I went bishop g6, and here I got excited a little bit because I saw that this pawn on b3 is kind of loose, and I thought maybe I can throw in bishop c2. So I did get excited for a moment. White played rook e3, defending the b3 pawn, and then I went bishop f5. The reason I did that is because I was wary of bishop h3 challenging my rook. For instance, if I go bishop c2 like I planned on, after bishop h3, I don't really have many moves on this file. And, I can't go to d8 because let's just see, d8's covered, d6 is covered, d5 is covered, d3 is covered because I can't go there because then he would trade everything and win a piece. So the only square is actually d4, but now there's bishop c3 forcing me off the file. I mean, I can go rook d8, but I'm not buying this after a move like rook e7. It just looks completely lost. So, yeah. I just played bishop f5 to just stop bishop h3. And now white went king f2, and it looks like my knight is just kind of trapped because if the king walks over, then my knight hangs. So it looks like I'm just kind of done. I went rook d4, trying to give my knight a square to go to. And now white played king e1, challenging my knight. And then I went knight e4 and was able to escape for a moment. But this position should still be lost. Bishop c3 now was played, challenging my my rook on d4. But this move is actually a mistake. This move is a mistake because now, after knight takes c3, I actually managed to trade one of my knights for the bishop. And yeah, I'm a pawn down, but it's a double pawn. Or actually, it's a triple pawn. So the question is white winning here with triple pawns against my position? Now, I actually think the answer is no. I do have very weak pawns on this side, and I think white is still close to +1 advantage if you ran it through the computer. But I actually think now I have a chance if we get to rook endgames where I can kind of hold on based upon the fact that he has triple pawns. Unfortunately here, I was in this chronic time trouble, as I mentioned before, and I got a little bit too overzealous, and I blundered right here and now in a position where if I moved the rook back with rook d7, I could kind of hold on here. A sample line could have been b4, g6, b5, again, trying to pry open my pawns on the light squares, and then takes, c6, takes, and we could add a scenario where I'm actually still fighting it out in an endgame, a pawn down. White probably could, still try to win this for a long time, but I'm not totally out of it. I mean, once you get to rook endgames, a pawn down, you have a chance. Unfortunately, in this position, instead of rook d7, I played rook d3, thinking that if I trade these rooks, I get and I just keep the bishops on the board, I can get to an endgame that's a easy draw because of these triple pawns. Part of my rationale was that if white tries to play b4 and b5 in some of those positions, I could play a5 and make a pass pawn of my own. But I missed a very, very important detail. After rook takes d3 and bishop takes d3, white has the very, very obvious bishop h3. And the issue is now this bishop comes to c8 and just takes the house. I realized immediately after I'd played rook d3 that he could take and go bishop h3. But, you know, I was basically playing on increment and just overlooked this in my time trouble. And it's really a shame because I'd managed to defend a horrible position for a few moves, or more than a few moves, and you know, he kind of lost the thread. I played a few more moves just because I was in shock. I played a5, but it doesn't change the story. After king d2, just challenging my bishop, first, I resigned because now my bishop needs to go back, and then bishop c8 is played, and I just lose this pawn and the game. And 2 pawns is going to be too much to handle, even though they're tripled. He could play b4 and b5 and just run me over. So very, very tough. Note that if he did play bishop c8 right away, my idea was to play bishop f7, or excuse me, bishop c2. And the point was, now I was thinking maybe I could fight in this type of position. But even this endgame would be losing, frankly, because there can be bishop b7 and smush walking the pawn with c6, and it's probably still lost, but actually just more work for white. So the move that he played, king d2, just put an end to all of that immediately. So that was all she wrote. I resigned, and tough way to end it, but hey, it is what it is. All right, well, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please consider doing so by making a PayPal donation in the description below. Thanks. Take care.